The black veteran had just returned home from his service overseas, looking forward to a peaceful and simple day. He hadn't been back for long, and the weight of his military experience still weighed on him. The constant noise, the harsh conditions, and the endless pressure were still fresh in his mind. It was difficult to return to civilian life after what he had seen and done, but he was determined to make it work. He had heard about a local diner from a few people in town. It was a small family-run place, known for its homey feel and good food. Today, he was craving a meal that reminded him of home. He had spent the last few hours walking around town, trying to feel normal again. And now he just wanted a warm meal in peace. As he stepped into the diner, the air felt heavy with silence. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, and immediately, a coldness washed over him. He could feel the eyes of the staff on him, but he tried not to make a big deal out of it. The diner seemed a little old-fashioned, but that only added to its charm. The veteran took a deep breath and made his way to the counter. The man behind the counter, a white, middle-aged man with a stiff posture, didn't greet him with a smile. Instead, the owner gave him a once-over before grudgingly nodding toward an empty stool. The veteran sat down, feeling the weight of the owner's eyes on him, but he didn't let it bother him. He had been through much worse during his time in the military, and if a rude diner owner was all he had to deal with now, he would be fine. The menu was simple, and the veteran picked something he knew would hit the spot: a classic burger with fries. He waited patiently, glancing around the diner. It was small, cozy even, with old-fashioned pictures on the walls. It felt like a place where people had been coming for years, a place that had seen its fair share of regulars. Still, something about the place felt off to him today, like an invisible barrier that he couldn't quite put his finger on. The owner slid the menu across the counter, not making eye contact, and asked, "What do you want?" "I'll have the burger with fries," the veteran replied, trying to keep things casual. The owner grunted, turning his back without saying anything else. The veteran watched as the owner moved to the kitchen, his posture rigid. The veteran wasn't sure why, but he felt an odd sense of discomfort in the air. It wasn't just the silence or the lack of a friendly greeting. It was something deeper, something unsettling about the way the owner looked at him. Minutes passed, and the veteran tried to ignore the strange feeling that grew in his chest. He had been through so much in his life. He didn't need to let something as trivial as an unfriendly diner owner ruin his day. But the longer he sat there, the more he felt like an outsider. It wasn't just the silence. It was the looks he was getting from the few people in the diner. The whispers, the side glances. He tried to brush it off, but when the owner finally returned with his food, the plate was slammed onto the counter with a little more force than necessary. The veteran looked up, meeting the owner's eyes for the first time. The expression on the man's face was cold and dismissive. "Enjoy your meal," the owner said, his tone sharp, almost mocking. He didn't wait for a response before walking away. The veteran, trying to maintain his composure, reached for his drink. He didn't know exactly what it was that bothered him, but there was no mistaking that something wasn't right. He had always been able to read people well during his time in the military, and this felt like something personal. But he wasn't sure why. The veteran's mind wandered as he sat at the counter, picking at his fries. His mind wasn't really on the food. It had been a long time since he'd been home, and coming back had been harder than he had expected. The life he had known before his time in the military seemed so distant now. Things had changed, but not in ways he had hoped. Growing up, he had always been proud of his family. They weren't rich, but they had what they needed. His father was a strong man, respected in their small town. He had always tried to teach the veteran about honor, duty, and standing up for what's right. But his father's lessons weren't always easy to follow. Life for a black family in a town full of prejudice was never simple. Still, his father worked hard, and the veteran always admired his strength. When he was old enough, the veteran enlisted in the military. It wasn't an easy decision, but it felt like the right one. He wanted to make a difference, to show that he could stand on his own and fight for something bigger than himself. The military life was tough, but he quickly learned the skills he needed to survive. The brotherhood that came with it, the sense of purpose, and the feeling of being part of something greater than himself kept him going. Every day, he pushed himself harder, never allowing himself to show weakness. In a world where people looked down on him because of his skin, he had to prove himself over and over again. There were moments during his service when he questioned everything: the violence, the long nights, the fear, but in the end, he knew he was doing the right thing. And when his time came to return home, he did so with pride. But as he walked through the doors of that diner, something felt different. It was strange how much he had changed during his time away. He thought he would return to a world where things had stayed the same, but nothing was as he remembered. People treated him differently now. His uniform still held weight, but it felt like it wasn't enough to break through the barriers that had always existed. He had been to war and back, but here he was, back in the same small town, treated like an outsider. It was the first time in years that he had felt so small, so invisible. As he sat there, the weight of his experiences started to creep in. He thought about the people he had left behind, the friends he had lost, the things he had seen that no one could ever understand unless they had lived through it. The quiet moments of peace he had hoped for seemed far away now. He had wanted to come back to a life of simplicity, to find comfort in the familiar. But instead, he found more of the same challenges, ones he thought he had left behind. The veteran pushed his plate away, no longer interested in the food. His stomach felt heavy, and it wasn't from hunger. It was from everything he had been carrying, emotionally, physically, mentally. He knew the journey ahead wasn't going to be easy. The world had moved on, and he would have to find his place in it again. But right now, all he could do was sit there and try to make sense of the strange feeling that had settled in his chest. There was something about this town, about this place, that didn't sit right with him anymore. Something had changed, and he wasn't sure if it was him or the world around him. Either way, he wasn't sure how to fix it. As the veteran sat there in silence, trying to collect his thoughts, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He had already dealt with so much during his time in the military, but it seemed like no matter where he went, there was always something trying to pull him back into a world of judgment and discomfort. He just wanted to blend in, to find peace in a place he once called home. But here he was, feeling like an outsider again. The diner was quiet except for the clinking of plates and the soft murmur of conversation in the background. The veteran looked around, taking in the faces of the other customers, but it seemed like no one was really paying attention to him. There were a few regulars, sitting at their usual spots, talking amongst themselves, but even they seemed to keep their distance, as if the atmosphere in the room had shifted in some subtle, uncomfortable way. His food was untouched now. The burger, once appealing, now sat on his plate, cold and uninviting. The veteran was lost in thought, trying to make sense of everything that had happened since his return. He couldn't help but feel the sting of the owner's cold reception, the way he had been treated like an unwelcome guest. It wasn't the first time he had encountered racism in his life, but something about the way the diner owner had acted felt personal, almost as if the man had a reason to hold a grudge against him specifically. He had dealt with discrimination before, and he knew how to handle it. But this was different. The disrespect he had experienced in this diner wasn't just casual, it felt pointed. It wasn't just about who he was, but about something deeper, something he couldn't understand. The veteran had learned to ignore the stares and the whispered comments over the years, but today, something about this encounter was gnawing at him. He took a deep breath and tried to focus on the present. He didn't want to make a scene. He had learned the hard way that fighting back wasn't always the solution. He had seen too many people go down that road, only to find that it led to more trouble. He just wanted to move on, to finish his meal and leave without further confrontation. But the silence in the room weighed heavily on him, and the longer he sat there, the more he realized that he couldn't just ignore what had happened. The veteran tried to make eye contact with the owner as he passed by, but instead of offering even a flicker of recognition, the owner's gaze remained cold, unwavering. The lack of any warmth or acknowledgement made it clear that this wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was intentional. The veteran's mind raced as he thought back to the words the owner had said when he first arrived. They hadn't been overtly racist, but they had been filled with an unmistakable condescension. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the tone, the way the owner carried himself as if he were somehow better. But the veteran wasn't the kind of person to back down. He had been through worse. He had stood strong in the face of danger, in the heat of battle, and in moments where others might have crumbled. This, however, felt different. It wasn't a fight he could win with strength alone. It wasn't something that could be solved with a simple confrontation. This was something deeper, a kind of quiet prejudice that ran through the veins of the town and clung to the people in ways that were hard to see. As he sat there, he felt a mix of anger and confusion. He didn't know what he expected from this town, from this diner. He had hoped for some semblance of familiarity, a reminder of the life he once knew. But now he felt more out of place than ever before. The weight of it all was beginning to settle on his shoulders, and he couldn't shake the feeling that things would never be the same again. His return had been filled with hopes of finding peace, but instead, he was met with a harsh reality he hadn't anticipated. The world had changed, and so had he. The veteran sat back in his seat, lost in thought, his mind drifting back to his father. He had always looked up to the man, admired his strength, and his unwavering determination. His father had been a towering figure in their small town, known for his work ethic and his ability to hold his ground in tough situations. But as the veteran sat there in the diner, he couldn't help but wonder if there was more to his father than he had ever been told. Growing up, his father had taught him about the importance of respect, of standing tall in the face of adversity. He had always made it clear that they weren't going to let anyone push them around, that no matter what the world thought of them, they had to keep moving forward. The veteran had admired his father's strength, even when the world seemed to be against them. But there were things about his father's past that the veteran had never fully understood. He had always heard whispers from people in town, murmurs about his father's involvement in things that didn't seem quite right. The veteran had never asked too many questions, figuring it was just small-town gossip. His father never spoke of it, and that was enough for him. He believed his father was a good man who did his best, who worked hard for his family, and who had earned the respect he was given. Still, there were moments when the veteran had wondered. He had overheard conversations between his parents, conversations that were hushed and full of tension. There were times when his father would come home late at night, his face hard and distant, as if he were carrying a heavy burden. But his father never shared those things with him. The veteran had grown up thinking that his father was just a man of principle, someone who fought for what was right. It was only after his military service that he began to realize that life wasn't always so simple. As he sat in the diner, his mind began to turn over the things he had heard in the past, rumors about his father's involvement in some kind of crime. It wasn't that he didn't trust his father, but the pieces of the puzzle didn't seem to fit together anymore. The veteran had always assumed that the whispers were just that, empty words. But now, in this moment of discomfort, those whispers started to feel like something more. He couldn't help but wonder if his father's actions had left a shadow over him, one that he had never fully understood. The way the diner owner treated him, the hostility he felt in the air, it was all starting to make sense in a way he hadn't anticipated. He thought back to the last time he had seen his father before he left for the military. It had been a brief conversation, one that ended with a hug and a few words of advice. His father had always been proud of him, but now, sitting in this diner, the veteran couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the story that he had never been told. What had his father done? Was there something about his past that had left a scar on their family, something that had shaped the way others saw them? The veteran hadn't wanted to believe it. He hadn't wanted to consider the possibility that his father's actions, whatever they had been, might have set the stage for the treatment he was receiving now. But the longer he sat there, the more he realized that there were things about his father's life that he might never truly understand. And perhaps there were things about his own life that he still had to figure out. He thought about the diner owner again, the way he had treated him, the coldness, the dismissiveness. It was all starting to feel less like a personal attack and more like a reflection of something deeper, something buried in the past. The veteran didn't know what to make of it, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that his father's shadow was hanging over him, influencing the way others saw him, even now. The veteran sat quietly, turning the thought over in his mind, feeling like there was something he was missing. He hadn't expected to feel this way when he returned home. All he wanted was peace, a chance to reconnect with the life he had left behind. But now, sitting in this diner, he was tangled in confusion and questions he hadn't known he had. As he tried to make sense of the tension in the air, a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. The diner owner, the same man who had treated him so coldly, was standing near the counter. The veteran had almost forgotten about him in the haze of his own thoughts, but now there he was again, staring at him as if he had been waiting for something. "Your father," the owner suddenly said, his voice hard. The words hung in the air, as though they carried a weight far heavier than the veteran had expected. For a moment, the veteran didn't respond. He wasn't sure what the owner meant. He had never been one to speak much about his father's past, so the comment caught him off guard. "I don't know if you've heard," the diner owner continued, his eyes narrowing as he took a step closer, "but your father wasn't just some hard-working man. There were things he did that people around here don't forget." The veteran's heart raced. The words hit him like a sudden storm. He had known there were whispers, but he had always shrugged them off as nothing more than town gossip. To hear someone speak so plainly, so openly, about his father's past was jarring. The veteran hadn't asked for these details. He didn't want to hear them. The diner owner leaned in, his tone darkening. He was involved in something big, something that hurt a lot of people. "And your name? Well, your name carries that same weight." The veteran's stomach sank. He felt his face flush with anger, confusion, and embarrassment. He had never asked about his father's past because he didn't want to know. Now here he was, hearing these words from a man who barely knew him. The sense of humiliation was overwhelming. He had come to this diner for a quiet meal, and now he was learning that his family's past was a shadow that followed him wherever he went. He had spent his whole life trying to make something of himself, to show people that he was his own person, separate from the legacy of his father. Yet here was this man, throwing his father's past in his face, reminding him that no matter how hard he tried, some things would always be tied to him. The weight of it all felt like too much. For a long moment, the veteran didn't speak. He wasn't sure what to say. He felt betrayed by the information, but at the same time, he couldn't deny the truth in the owner's words. His father had never mentioned anything about the past, and it had been a long time since the veteran had even thought about it. But now, the past was coming back in ways he hadn't expected, twisting into the present in ways that felt impossible to untangle. The diner owner, seeing the effect his words had, took a step back, as if he had said too much. But it was too late. The damage was done. The veteran's mind was reeling, his emotions tangled. He had wanted answers, but now he felt more lost than ever. His father's past wasn't just a personal matter. It was something that affected him, something that people were still holding against him. He could feel the weight of the owner's words pressing on his chest, suffocating him, leaving him with more questions than answers. "I didn't know," the veteran finally said, his voice quieter than he had intended. The words felt weak, as if they could never make up for the shock and confusion he was feeling. But it was the only thing he could say in the face of everything that had just been revealed. The veteran felt a chill run through him, the weight of the diner owner's words lingering in the air long after the conversation had ended. His mind was spinning, trying to process everything at once. He had always believed that the past, his father's past, was something buried away, forgotten by most. But now, It seemed that the shadow of his father's actions was far from gone. The veteran had always prided himself on forging his own path, making a name for himself that wasn't tied to anyone else's mistakes. But now, with the owner's words echoing in his ears, he wondered how much of that was truly possible. He had never asked his father about the rumors that had surrounded their family. As a child, he had heard the whispers, the things people said when they thought no one was listening. But his father had always shut down any questions, brushing them aside with a stern look and a change of subject. It was a rule in their household: never talk about the past. The veteran had accepted that for years, never pressing too hard to uncover what lay beneath the surface. But now, sitting in this diner, it felt as though his father's secrets had been pushed into his lap, and he was expected to deal with them. The veteran felt a mix of emotions. Part of him wanted to confront the owner right then and there, to ask him for more details, to demand an explanation. But the other part of him, the part that had learned to stay calm, to keep his emotions in check, told him to walk away. He knew that getting caught up in a confrontation wouldn't solve anything. In fact, it would only make things worse. The truth was, the veteran wasn't sure what to do with the information he had just learned. How could he make sense of it? How could he move forward when his father's actions, which had been hidden for so long, were now thrust into his life, threatening everything he had worked so hard for? As the veteran sat there, lost in thought, he tried to focus on the one thing he knew for sure. He wasn't his father. He had spent his life proving that, building a reputation for himself, one that wasn't tied to the mistakes of those before him. But now, it seemed like that reputation was under attack. He could feel the eyes of the other customers in the diner, as if they were waiting for him to react, to say something, to defend himself. The veteran had always been taught to hold his head high, to never show weakness. But in that moment, sitting alone in the diner, he felt like a part of him was crumbling. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. There was no use in getting angry. He couldn't change what his father had done, and he couldn't control how others viewed him. But he could control how he responded. He could choose to rise above it, to keep moving forward, just as he had done before. The past was a part of him, yes, but it didn't define him. His actions, the way he carried himself, the way he treated others, that was what mattered. And if people were going to judge him for his father's mistakes, then they didn't deserve his time or his energy. The veteran stood up slowly, pushing his plate away, the uneaten food still sitting there, forgotten. He glanced at the diner owner, who was watching him with a mixture of curiosity and smug satisfaction. Without saying a word, the veteran turned and walked out of the diner, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft chime. As he stepped outside, the fresh air hit his face, the cool breeze feeling like a reminder that there was more to life than the weight of the past. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew one thing for sure. He was going to keep moving forward, no matter what anyone else thought of him. For the first time in a long while, the veteran felt a sense of resolve settle within him. He wasn't going to let the past control his future. He had already faced so much in his life, and he had come out stronger because of it. Whatever came next, he was ready. As the veteran stepped out of the diner, the cool air hit him, and he took a deep breath, trying to shake off the weight of everything that had just been revealed. He didn't want to feel anger or shame, but it was hard to ignore the feeling of humiliation that had settled in his chest. For years, he had worked so hard to prove himself, to show that he wasn't defined by his past or the mistakes of his family. But now, it seemed like all of that hard work might be in vain. The diner owner's words echoed in his mind, and he found himself wondering if anyone in town would ever truly see him for who he was, not just for who his father had been. The veteran knew that he couldn't change the past. He couldn't undo what had happened, no matter how much he wanted to. But that didn't mean he had to accept the weight of it hanging over him forever. He had to find a way to rise above it, to take control of his own story. He had spent so much of his life battling external forces, fighting wars, facing prejudice, and overcoming countless challenges. But this felt different. This was a battle within himself, a struggle to reclaim his identity in the face of a past he hadn't even been fully aware of. He walked down the quiet streets, his footsteps echoing in the stillness, his mind racing with thoughts. He knew that he couldn't just let this go, couldn't ignore the impact it would have on his life going forward. But he also knew that he couldn't let it consume him. He couldn't allow the mistakes of his father to dictate how the world saw him. That wasn't who he was. The man he had become, the veteran who had fought for his country, who had learned the value of respect, who had shown nothing but dignity in the face of adversity, was the person he had to hold on to. As he walked, he thought about what had brought him to this point. The years of service, the struggles, the triumphs, and the moments of doubt. He had always been driven by a sense of duty, a need to do what was right, no matter the cost. But now, it wasn't just about the people he had served with or the uniform he wore. It was about proving to himself that he was more than the weight of his family's past. He had to believe that. He had to remind himself that his worth wasn't defined by where he came from, but by who he was and what he chose to do with his life. The streets felt quieter now, the weight of the past still lingering but beginning to lift. He realized that no matter how many people in town would continue to judge him based on things they didn't fully understand, it didn't change the fact that he had earned his place in the world. He had fought for it. He had earned every step he had taken. He found himself at the edge of the town, standing in front of a small park where he had spent time as a child. It was a place that held memories of simpler days, before everything had become complicated by the unspoken truths of his family's history. As he stood there, looking out over the familiar scenery, he felt a sense of peace beginning to settle in. He had come home seeking comfort, but instead, he had found something far more valuable: a new sense of purpose. The veteran knew that his journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead, more moments where he would have to confront the past and decide who he wanted to be in the future. But in that moment, standing in the park, he felt a quiet strength building within him. He wasn't the man his father had been. He wasn't defined by the rumors or the mistakes of the past. He was his own man, and it was time to embrace that truth. With that thought, the veteran turned and began walking back into town, ready to face whatever came next with the same determination that had always carried him forward. The past might have shaped him, but it wouldn't control him. The future was his to create. As the veteran made his way back into town, a sense of clarity began to wash over him. The confusion and turmoil of the last few hours were slowly being replaced with a quiet strength. He had walked out of the diner feeling defeated, but now, as he strolled down the familiar streets, he realized that his journey wasn't just about confronting the past. It was about reclaiming control of his life. He had spent so long trying to understand who he was in the context of his father's actions, but now he understood that it was his own choices, his own actions, that defined him. The veteran's footsteps were steady, his mind calm. He had always been a man of action, someone who believed in doing rather than dwelling. But now, with everything that had happened, he had taken the time to pause, to reflect on what truly mattered. His father's past, the rumors that had followed him, the diner owner's harsh words, they were all pieces of a puzzle he didn't need to solve. He didn't need to carry the weight of those things any longer. What mattered was how he chose to move forward. He thought about the people in the town who had always seen him for who he was, not just the son of his father, but a man who had served his country, a man who had earned the right to stand tall. He realized that not everyone in town would hold his father's past against him. There would always be those who judged him, who saw him as nothing more than a reflection of the mistakes of others. But that was something he couldn't control. What he could control was how he responded to those people. He could choose to be the kind of man who rose above their expectations, who made a difference not just with words, but with actions. The more he thought about it, the more he understood that this wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. This was about proving something to himself. He had spent so many years fighting battles for others, but now it was time to fight for his own peace, for his own sense of self-worth. He wasn't defined by the things people whispered about him or the family legacy that had followed him. He was defined by the choices he made and the man he had become. As he neared his house, the familiar sight of the front porch brought a sense of calm. It was the same porch he had sat on many years ago, the same porch where he had sat with his father, listening to stories of days long gone. The house, though modest, had always been a symbol of the stability his father had tried to create for their family. And now it was a symbol of his own journey, a journey that was just beginning. He took a deep breath as he stood on the steps, looking out at the horizon. The world seemed a little quieter now, a little less burdened by the weight of the past. He knew that there would be more challenges ahead. He knew that there would be moments when the past would resurface, when the mistakes of others would try to cast a shadow over his own life. But in that moment, he felt ready to face whatever came next. He had faced battles before, but this battle, the battle to define who he was the one that mattered most. With a final glance at the town, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He didn't need the approval of others to feel whole. He didn't need to explain himself to anyone. The man he had become was enough. The future was his to shape, and for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace with that.